Alrighty.
Ooh, there's reverb.
There we go. Mute the
There we
computer.
go.
There's always some setting that I forgot to change. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our weekly Wednesday deep dive. My name is Nick Griffin. I'm the lead pastor here at Wayfarers Christian Church. I'm joined, as always, by our teaching pastor here, Noah Randolph.
Hey.
And we have a special guest again this week. Very special guest. Jacob Dooley.
What's up, everybody?
Jacob's, if you're an OG deep dive fan and you've been watching for us for a long time, you'll remember Jacob from a few months ago. But Jacob also works with us here at Wayfarers, does all kinds of really cool online social media stuff. He runs our TikTok page, so if you guys have not followed us on TikTok yet, go follow his page. It's at bearded_Christian.
Bird for that. Is it like you tick the talk, or like what do people say when they watch TikTok? Do they just like say, "I watch TikTok"? Or do you like?
Yeah. I watch TikTok. Yeah, that's the
pull up the talk, or you pull up the tick.
Yeah, you sound like all the 50-year-olds on the end. That's exactly what you sound like.
Yeah. I'm not on TikTok, as you can probably tell.
Noah does not tick the talk. So.
No, he does not.
Unlike us. But yeah, if you have not had a chance to follow us yet on there, I definitely would encourage you to do that, and you'll see a lot more of Jacob there. But we thought it'd be cool to bring him on today on this Deep Dive podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, this podcast is kind of our opportunity to do exactly what the title says. We go a little bit deeper on some of the topics that we have been covering in our Sunday services. We try to talk about some of the issues that would be a little bit too involved to talk about during a sermon or during a Sunday service. And we just kind of use it as an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better and, talk about some things that are important to us. We are actually nearing the end of our series on the Sermon on the Mount. It has been the entirety of this year we have been focusing on the Sermon on the Mount. We've only got a few paragraphs left right there at the end, a few major sections.
Yeah. So it's like from January to April, so about 4 months.
Yeah. So we've just been taking it verse by verse. We have been going through the Sermon on the Mount. And last Sunday, I preached specifically on a section that I talked about, at least in my church experience. People just skip over this passage when they're preaching Sermon on the Mount. And a lot of it was because of a fear of being lumped in with people part of the prosperity gospel, because it's a difficult passage to reconcile. And it's the one where Jesus says that if you ask something, ask and you will receive, is kind of the big key phrase that starts it. And he goes on to sort of justify that point by pointing out the fact that we know how to give good gifts to our children. If our children ask us for something, we're not going to give them something evil in return or in exchange. And he's like, if we know how to do that, if we know how to treat our kids good and give them good gifts, then of course God's going to do the same with us. So it's one of those passages that should be encouraging. It should be something that's really encouraging. And that was one of the angles I tried to take with it this last Sunday, was just being like, I don't want to sweep that under the rug. I do want to really affirm that truth that Jesus is saying. And in some way or another, he does say that God wants to give us the things that we ask of him, and that he's a good father who gives us good gifts. And I think that's really important. But I sort of spent the latter half of the sermon talking about we have to admit, the difficulty, and one of the other reasons people skip over this passage is that there are times in our lives when we do not receive the things that we ask for. When we ask God to do something and it seems like he does not answer our prayer. And there's lots of answers that Christians will give as to why that happens. Why does this thing happen that seems to violate what Jesus says himself in this passage? And I covered a couple of them in the sermon, but we wanted to take this opportunity to talk about some of the other answers that people might give. And this is the deep dive, so we're going to dive deep. I pitched it as we want to talk about some of the a little more dense, a little more theologically dense, a little more biblically dense type answers to that question. that we could give. But so that's what we're going to do today. But before we do the deep dive and dive in, we got Jacob on. We've been occasionally, at the beginning, we used to do these quirky query get to know you questions all the time. We thought it'd be fun to bring that back for this week's episode again. Hopefully we can get some interesting answers from Jacob.
Oh.
So this is our get to know you section, quirky queries. Noah, you said you've got one for us, right?
I do. This will require a story from everyone that hears the question. I was thinking about this, and I'm not. I don't know if I know either of y'all's answers on this. Which usually I know Nick's, so this is going to be interesting. Have either of you experienced something that you would qualify as a miracle? And if so, what is that story? And it doesn't have to be like the most obvious miracle in the world, but a case in which our theme today is God answering prayers, and oftentimes, in the Bible at least, God will answer prayers through miracles. And so I was just curious if either of you have stories of any type of thing like that. It doesn't have to be wildly supernatural. It could be just, something occurring that was natural but happened to answer one of your prayers. I'm just curious story-wise. I think we'll start with Nick because I imagine he has an answer more prepped than maybe Jacob, just because
Sure.
I sprung it on him.
And you're thinking personally or just stories we've heard?
It can be, I would say personally, since this is about getting to know everybody.
Yeah. Because I have heard some cool stories like that from other people that I've known about the sort of miraculous answers to prayer.
Yeah.
But as far as like really like wow you kind of situations, I can't think of any huge ones like that off the top of my head. One, though, that I do reference a lot that was really foundational time for me was, I've told this story in a sermon before. It was just a few weeks ago, actually. It was the story about how we came up with the name for Toby, for our son. So if you want the full story, how long ago was that? Like a month ago, maybe?
It might have been a month ago, yeah.
You can go back in our feed where I'll give you more the full story there. But the short version of it basically was just that I was going through a season of a lot of anxiety issues and a lot of religious turmoil. Like I had a lot of issues as I was trying to like theologically deal with certain things and what I thought about God, and became pretty convinced that one of the biggest solutions I needed to be convinced that God was good, that God cared about me, that he was a good father, all this stuff that we just talked about in this sermon on Sunday. And I didn't talk about it much on Sunday, but this is one of my favorite verses in the Sermon on the Mount because of all of that, because this was super important to me. It was one of those freeing truths that really helped me, changed the difficulties I was having in my life, was when I learned to really trust that God is a good father. So if you tune in a lot, you'll hear me harp on those points a lot, but it's because they're personally important. So I knew that was something that was important to me. I needed to trust and learn that God was good, but I was having a hard time with it. It's one thing to read it in the Bible. It's a different thing to have your life experience back it up. And we were at the Bible Museum, the Museum of the Bible in D.C. We were visiting some family members, and they had a display that had Bible names on it, and this was right before our son Toby was about to be born. I was there with Adrian, and we still had not figured out a name for him, and it was like a month out before he was going to be born. It was kind of near in the wire, and I was like, oh, this would be a cool place to find a name for Toby. And it was like this big touch screen. You could like sit there and scroll through the touch screen, and I can't tell you exactly what the prayer was, but it was kind of one of those quick, you just throw up a quick prayer kind of thing where I was just asking God to help us pick a name. And we scrolled, we clicked, we stopped, and the name we stopped on was Tobias, the name of our son Tobias. Toby is what we call him. But what's really impactful is that name means the Lord is good. And it was one of those moments where it really felt like God, knowing that I needed something a little bit more to really be convinced of that, And so he was like, here's this little thing, name your son this. Every time you say his name, you'll be reminded of that truth. And so it was like a prayer I was asking God, help us name our son. And he answered that prayer along with so many of my other prayers before, which was like, help convince me that you are good, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was pretty impactful.
Yeah,
So,
that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to retell it even.
Yeah,
If you have already.
for
So
sure.
I think that's great. What about you, Jacob?
Well, as I was sitting here trying to really think of one specific time, really, honestly, a lot of my life has just been a continuous miracle. In the way that I haven't always had a whole lot of money. My family hasn't always had a whole lot of money. Yet, my dad always says he wish he has the same favor I do with God, because just about any time I need something, someone somewhere just is getting rid of that. Or a couple examples that are just from my life scattered about. For a while in high school, my bed was an air mattress. I didn't have a physical bed. I slept on a floor with an air mattress. And one day, one of the men in the church that we were going to told me to go to this place. And when I went, it was a mattress store. And so they had me try out like 3 of the best mattresses they had for a twin-size bed. And then they just put it in the back of my truck for free. I don't know if the other guy paid for it or not. I don't know the full story on that end, but I know what happened to me was I was provided a mattress out of nowhere, which I still use to this day.
Yeah.
Another one is my car. I worked all summer right before I came here to Mid-South Christian College. I worked all summer to save up to buy a new car because my truck quit. And I was like, well, I'm going to get the money out of the bank so I can just have it in my hand in case I come upon a vehicle that I can buy. And the moment I was leaving the bank, I received a message for somebody saying they'll sell me their car for that much money.
For the exact amount you had in your hands. That's awesome.
And I looked at it. It was good. It's the car I drive now, 4 years later, almost 4 years later. And in the spirit of like talking about, God being a good father, he's been that multiple times throughout my life. In the times it's like when you're growing up, you kind of trust your dad will get you what you need. You have clothes because your dad went to the store and bought. Well, usually it's your mom, but someone reminded your dad to go do it. But you're always provided for growing up by your parents usually, and so that was my experience with God. Growing up and in my life, anytime I ever needed something, it was provided for me in some way that's not always
super explainable or whatever.
It's just like randomly something will happen. Somebody will contact me and be like, "Hey, I have this thing." I was like, "Well, I was just looking for that thing, and this will be a great way for me to get it."
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great example. That's what your dad said. He's like, "Man, I wish I had that."
Yeah. We always. I was like, I don't need to know how to work on a car because if my car breaks down, somebody shows up in my life. It's like, yeah, I'll look at that.
That's cool. Yeah. No, that's a great example. Do you have one, Noah?
Yeah. I've told bits and pieces of it to people, but I don't know if I've ever told the full story. Most of you know that have been tuning in every week that if you're, like Nick said, an OG member of the Deep Dives, I worked at a coffee shop for a very long time called Avenue Coffee, and it comes up again. I know we get bugged all the time for how many times.
How many times can you mention Avenue Coffee in one episode?
But one of the things that was really difficult for me in that was my time managing it. When I began to manage it, I found out that the business was not doing so well. The first day that I opened up the bank account and got all the information and looked at everything, we had negative $4,000 in the bank account, so that was a fun day. And so for the next year, I was responsible for how to take a business that had not just no money, but was negative in money to, a place where I didn't have to worry about paying employees on time and things. And I will say that before taking that position and after, my prayer life looked radically different. And I'll never forget, we were not doing so well because I took over in around March. And summer is notoriously the slow season for coffee shops. If you don't know, most people like to go and walk in parks. They don't like hot drinks, and usually the hot drinks are like what sells better than the cold drinks. Avenue, I didn't realize this at the time, but Avenue would always do cold brew for all of our drinks. And if you know anything about coffee, you know that ratios are smaller for cold brew than they are for like hot liquids, and so you lose money.
Is like your most expensive drink to make.
It's the most expensive drink to make is cold brew, and so you lose more money when you're making like an iced latte if you're using cold brew than if you were using like a shot of espresso or something like that. And so we were losing a lot of money in the summer anyway, and we were hoping for fall because fall is always like our best months, and I didn't think we were going to make it. Like I started in March with $4,000 in the negative. We basically had April left, and then it would be May, June, and July, which were all our worst months business-wise. And so, yeah, I basically had to figure out how am I going to keep this place going in our worst 3 months. And the interesting thing was, as I was like praying to God every night and just like really like pouring my heart out, I didn't get an answer right away. May was what we expected May to be, but somehow we survived. I learned a lot of how to manage finances and move money around so that things got paid on time. But seemed like in some ways I would say that was the small miracle, is that everything, I'm still not sure how everything got paid, but everything did. And we definitely did not make a profit that month, but I was able to get through May, and in June I was kind of at my wit's end. Always on June 4th is when rent was due, and rent was always our biggest expense. It was like $3,750, and generally what would happen is I'd spend everything paying off the employee bills. I'd pay my employees for their payroll, and then I'd have $0 by June 1st. And so I'd need $3,750 by the 4th. And sometimes God would show up and the landlord wouldn't cash that check until like the 10th or 11th or 12th. And so the money would come in by that time. Sometimes things didn't happen that way and he would cash it immediately, and you just had to pray. But I'll never forget one moment. I can't remember exactly when it happened, maybe in June 15th. We'd gotten through the landlord check and everything was fine there, but I didn't have enough for payroll. I didn't really have enough for some expenses, and I was trying to fix some things at Avenue, and I just felt like really discouraged that all of this was not going to work out and that I'm failing everybody here. And I got a check in the mail from MLGW that was a $2,000 check. As a basically it was like a rebate for, we had done like a security deposit from MLGW way back in the day when we had started the accounts and everything like that, and so we had proven ourselves as a business for a couple of years, and we're like, okay, you can get your security deposit check back. And I was able to, after that $2,000 check, that really was what kept us going through the summer and into the next fall and spring terms. So that was, I would say, the moment when I really knew that God at least was with me in what I was doing, and that he wasn't like just leaving me out to dry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. And you've told me several times, that whole experience at Avenue really helped your prayer life in general. So, like you said. So, no, that's good. Those are all really good examples, I think, from our own lives. That's really cool. That's a great question to lead into what we're talking about today.
Oh, yeah.
Got to give Garrett Moss a shout out too. He's waved at us. He's watching. Hey, Garrett.
Wave creepily. Somebody meme that.
I'll get on it.
We'll make it happen. So what we wanted to talk about was some of the answers for when we don't feel like God answers our prayers.
Mm-hmm.
And we all, I'm sure, could also share just as many stories of
God not
God
answering.
not answering our prayers. And so there's been different ways that Christians have responded to that problem over the centuries. I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that the Bible itself is aware of this issue. I think sometimes people feel like they're the first ones that have figured this out, and they don't realize that we're going on several thousand years where human beings have been in this relationship with God, and it is something that has come up at other points in time. Noah, you've helped me see a lot of times in the Old Testament where that is the exact thing that the people are saying sometimes. They're just saying, they're directly saying to God, why aren't you answering us when we're talking to you?
Especially if you've read the Psalms. The Psalms, I feel like, have that more than any other book in the Bible.
Yeah.
There's Psalm 88 and Psalm 89. If you haven't read those Psalms yet, go read those Psalms. And I think if you're in a place where you feel like God is not answering, you will feel very much heard after reading those songs.
Psalm 88 and 89.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's a good reference.
Yeah, we
there.
could read it if you wanted to. It's your,
Sure.
Do we have time?
That seems perfect, because that's kind of my first point I wanted to make, was just like the Bible itself does address some of these issues.
Yeah.
So the reason I bring that up is because sometimes I think people feel like they have to come up with some sort of philosophical, apologetics, theological answer for this. And sometimes one of the best things we can do is go straight to the history of people dealing with this particular issue that you see a lot in the Bible itself. So, like, that's just kind of been important to me.
Yeah.
You got it pulled up?
Yep. It's not a long psalm at all. It's only got like 10, 13, 18 verses. That's not bad. O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am a man who has no strength, like one set loose among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eyes grow dim through sorrow. Every day I call upon you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the departed rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? But I, O Lord, cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? Afflicted and close to death from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I am helpless. Your wrath has swept over me. Your dreadful assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me together. You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. So it's a very dark psalm.
Yeah.
And it's
good.
probably surprising to people sometimes to realize that's
in the Bible.
the psalm.
Yeah.
And it's not like it ends with some like, but oh, don't worry, I'm still going to praise you or whatever. It is a psalm that just shows the real depths of what someone is feeling and how they feel as somebody who is feeling like God is not listening to them.
Yeah.
And so that would be the first place I would tell a lot of people to start, is just look through some of these passages in the Bible and realize that you are not alone in feeling this way, and that other people have felt that way before as well. Now, related to that, there's actually a whole book of the Bible that deals with this particular issue really well. We were talking about it right before we went on camera here, and Jacob, you were bringing up a little bit that one of your responses to a lot of people would be to reference a particular book of the Bible. And tell us a little bit about what your approach would be as far as that goes.
Yeah, so for a while, one of my favorite books of the Bible was Job. The whole story revolves around a guy who is called blameless before God, by God himself. He does all the right things. He's tried to bring up his children in the right way. He sacrifices to God regularly. Yet he loses everything in this, according to the book, in a matter of a day.
Yeah.
Everything is stripped from him. His children, his livestock, his land, his servants, all things that he's known and come to care for is just gone. His health is gone. And he's just left wondering why God has all of a sudden abandoned him. And he prays and he tells everybody, I just want to get things straightened out with God. He feels so alone and abandoned by God. And that's what the majority of the book is, him just lamenting that God has either made a mistake or he's done something he doesn't realize, but he doesn't know what it is. And he has friends that tell him, hey, don't say God made a mistake. You just need to accept this and realize you've been cast out.
Right.
His wife comes to him and says, just curse God and die. And then God answers him later in the book. And he says, hey, where were you when I was forming the earth? Where were you when I was creating these majestic creatures that live and walk on the earth next to you? And the basic answer with that is that God has a bigger plan. God sees more than we can. Our perspective is not always what God sees. God has created such a beautiful world for us to enjoy. Surely we can trust that he has a plan for what's coming out of what we're doing.
Yeah. And that's a really good one to bring people to for all of those reasons that you mentioned. Because I've always said there's two big things I think you can get out of the book of Job. There's a million good things, but two of them that I like to emphasize. One is that I think the book of Job is basically like the Bible's proof that not everything that you are suffering is because of anything you did. Yeah. That suffering is not just a punishment for something bad that you did. And that's something that most human societies have had a really hard time wrestling with. I think people call it the retribution principle, which is just that, like, if you are going through suffering, you're suffering for something that you did.
Yeah.
And something interesting that somebody pointed out to me once is that most human cultures have had some version of a retribution principle. And that's where a lot of the ways that they've dealt with the gods and a lot of other religions, whether they call it karma, whether they call it punishment or discipline, they all kind of have this idea that, like, well, you go through bad things in life because it's either punishing you or shaping you for something that you did. And one of the kind of shocking things is that the book of Job is an example of a man who does nothing to deserve everything that happens to him, and yet it still happens to him. And so it's kind of depressing but freeing in a way, because I know a lot of people, maybe people with low self-esteem, people who feel certain ways about themselves, who will just be convinced that difficulties they're going through is because they did something and they deserve this. And I think that's one of the main things that A scholar I was reading really pointed out that a lot of people believe Job may be one of the first oldest books in the Bible, one of the first ones written. And from the beginning, basically, in the Jewish Christian world, it was very important to them to say, not all suffering is some sort of result of something that you have done. And so that's really important, I think, thing to get out of it. And that second point is the one that you were kind of hinting at there at the end with God's answer. But it's not the happy answer we wish would be at the end of Job.
No.
But it is an important one, I think, for us to emphasize sometimes, which is that we often are not in a position where we would even be able to see or understand what it is that God is doing.
Yeah.
And it's not really right of us sometimes to ask to understand that.
Well, and what's interesting about that is Job is part of the wisdom literature, and the wisdom literature is a collection. Sometimes some people say it's 4, some people say it's 3. I say it's 4. It's Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Those kind of books all I see as working in together and processing this question. Proverbs deals with basically what your sermon was, which is that God's going to be good to you, and he's going to give you what you need and what you want if you follow after him. And you can read Proverbs today. It's really easy to do, and you'll see that it's just a bunch of a father telling his son, which again, God is father, right? It's a bunch of father telling his son, if you do these things, good things are going to happen to you, right? And then the next book, Ecclesiastes, is the flip side of that same coin, in which Ecclesiastes makes the startling statement, but life is chance, and the rain falls on the good and the bad alike, and it's not always happy, sunny, rosy day, and basically calls into question everything that Proverbs has said up to this point and saying, I'm not sure that it's always the case. And then Job is the outworking of both of those two books in looking at one person's story, one individual story of he did everything right. He followed everything that he followed all the Proverbs, and instead of getting good things, he got bad things, right? And what does that look like for someone to go through that process, and what is God doing in that mindset? And the reason I think Song of Solomon should be included in that is the very next book in it is the finishing of that, in which you realize that love and true love, both in the sense of God loving humanity and a husband loving his wife, is the only thing that keeps us centered in belief towards what we're going towards, right? So it's like the answer to Job, I feel like, is not just sit down and shut up, because that's what you would get if you just stopped at Job. But I think the answer is sit down, wait, and then the full love that you're hoping for will come to its continuance in Song of Solomon. So hopefully, I don't know, I just wanted to give you an idea of the wisdom literature that I think that those 4 books bring is really kind of pushing that whole journey of faith in a lot of ways. And you can kind of see this too, even with the story of Israel and how everything works in the Bible. It's like you start out with a young idealistic Israel in Joshua. It's like, oh yeah, we'll follow all the laws of Leviticus, and we'll be able to do all of this stuff, right? And then they get to Israel and they fail, and things don't go out according to plan, and reality hits, right? Is that they're sinners, they're broken, they can't follow all of the laws like they thought they could, and then they get exiled, and they get treated horribly in exile, even though they have returned to following God, which is kind of the Job story, right? And it doesn't come to any sort of finish until Christ comes on the scene and dies for them as a statement of love, which I think is like the Song of Solomon story. So there are multiple ways that you can kind of see that working out. But I think that's the piece that I'm just starting to realize in my own life is that it doesn't have to end with Job, It doesn't have to end with just sit down and shut up,
Right.
it can continue on towards love.
And that's the cool thing about taking the Bible as a whole and reading all
Yeah.
of the different books and all the answers that it has and stuff like that. You can kind of get that kind of more complete and full answer all the way through. So that's definitely something we always talk about. Don't just stop in
Yeah.
one place and or another. But I do think that there is an order sometimes that those things need to go in, and sometimes we have to recognize our place before you can get to some of the other things, and so I think they kind of go in that order and different things like that. But obviously, outside of the scriptures themselves, all the people who have been living in relationship with God for all these thousands of years have been wondering about this same question themselves, and there have been different people that have offered different answers at different points in time. I really appreciated Noah, you shared with me earlier today about a book that you've been reading that deals with this particular topic. And so tell us about that book. You're not finished with it yet, right? So you don't know the full...
I don't know the full story yet.
But even a little bit of what you've gotten out of it seems to have been really, really helpful for you. And I think
really
it would
good.
be helpful for the people tuning in.
It's a book entitled God on Mute. And I downloaded it on Audible, so I'm ashamed to say I don't even know the author's name. I'm going to have to look that up.
Hold on, I'll Google it real quick.
I got it off of a recommendation from someone on Facebook that said this is just a really good audiobook. And so I downloaded
Pete Gregg.
Pete Gregg. Okay.
God on Mute, Engaging the Silence of Unanswered Prayer.
Yep. And several people have recommended it because they kind of pitched it as this is not your typical Christianese book where you get like the same old answers. And so I was really interested in it and picked it up. And so far the story has been about his own life of struggling with God not answering prayers, and also tackling this question of when God doesn't show up for other people. And his story so far has been that his wife was diagnosed with a brain tumor that caused her to have like seizures, and she's having to go into surgery where they're having to remove this brain tumor. It's the size of an orange, and like it's just really, it's not looking good. And I haven't gotten through all that to see like how the story pans out, but he's been talking about how he's been praying a lot during it, and she just seems to be getting worse. And I get a feeling that as the story progresses, it's not about her recovering, so to speak, but about him dealing with the fact that she's going to be changed for the rest of her life. He told this really moving story of how when they found out she was going to have surgery and they're going to have to remove this huge tumor, she wrote she had children already, and so she wrote last letters to her children, and to her husband, just in case the surgery doesn't go well. And she I thought this was really moving. They took last photos of everyone, just in case all the kids would have photos of their mom if she were to pass. And there's just a lot of moving things that the details of it. He does a really good job of describing the details, but he also is trying to talk to you, the reader, as you're listening to it, just he's trying to explain what grief feels like, and you can tell he's done his research. He's read C.S. Lewis comes up quite a bit in this book, and A Grief Observed is a huge one when it comes to the process of understanding brokenness and grief. And he talks a lot about the Holocaust, actually, and the process. He said something that I thought was really interesting. He said a lot of people will turn to the Holocaust as the first example of how God can't be true or can't be good, because why would a good God allow the Holocaust to happen? And he said what's funny is if they've done studies and interviews of all the survivors of the Holocaust, and remarkably, he said, only a very small margin of them recanted their faith after that experience. He actually said that there's an astounding number of people that switched from atheism to a religion after experiencing those Holocaust stories and moments and atrocities, and him just reporting on this and basically showing that the people that actually underwent these horrors are actually far more likely to deepen their faith than to leave it. And so for people to say, oh, this just proves that God is, not a good God or whatever, he seemed to be implying that only people that had not been experiencing those things would say something like that. Because the people that were actually experiencing the pain, only a very small percentage of them were angry at God and did leave the faith.
And of those that did leave, he talked about how he's kind of even skeptical of whether it is really fully leaving because
he said that all of them that essentially wanted to become atheists still had a lot of anger towards a God they no longer believed in, and would continue to talk about God as if he existed, even though they had become atheists.
And so it felt like a lot of the points he was making was there's obviously something different about that kind of suffering when you have experienced it. From the outside looking in, we think that is a proof that God can't possibly be good or powerful or whatever it might be. From the outside looking in on that kind of suffering, it looks like an example of a blow against God. But the statistics at least show that if that is the case, why is it so many people who go through that sort of suffering come out with their faith stronger, or still intact, or unchanged, and instead of kind of actually losing it as a result of that. And that's a question that needs to be
and he puts
answered and resolved in a way.
He puts in one actual interview in the book, which is really interesting, where the guy it was basically a question: did you ever question why God did this? Why God allowed this to happen? And I don't remember the Jew's name that was being interviewed, but he said, no, we never would question that, because he was all we had. It was like it was like the pain and suffering of it basically stripped them of everything but God, to the point that to question God would be to just bring in hopelessness. And so, for him at least, I got a lot out of that interview in the sense that for him that was the last thing that he had that attached him to humanity in any sense, to his own humanity.
His faith in God. And that reminds me of one of my first personal experiences where I really encountered what I would say is a deeper level of pain and suffering than I had experienced in my life before. Was not for me personally, but it was I took a mission trip with a group to the country of Haiti shortly after that big massive earthquake that they had. I guess it was 10 years ago now or whatever. And I was really impacted by that level of poverty and hunger and just everything that was going on in Haiti when I was driving around, just looking at how the people lived, looking at how little they had to live on, looking at how hungry they were, how much disease and sickness and pain they were going through. And what impacted me was going to church for the first Sunday while we were there in Haiti. And we went to this little bitty cinder block church, dirt floors, nothing, hardly anything there. And I still remember this. I felt, how sometimes in church you'll hear people sing praise songs to God and it feels
fake,
not genuine. Yeah. Cause it's just oh God, We love you.
Mhm.
There's this theologian I like who has this joke song he sings all the time where he says, "Oh Lord God, you're so terrific. Just for you, I'd swim the Pacific," or something like that. It's like it that can feel that way in our context.
Mhm.
When I was there with them in their church context, it was not fake.
Mhm.
They were so
Mm-hmm.
much happier than I felt like everybody I knew back home in the States.
Mm.
Even though they had nothing, they had more pain, they had more suffering, they had less of everything.
Mhm.
And their joy felt more authentic, and it felt like it truly was in God.
Mm.
And I remember me and all the other group that were there was really impacted by this, like their singing and everything. It like felt real. It felt really,
Yeah.
joyful. So we all went back and we were trying to talk it through. And one of the guys in our group was just like, I think he kind of said the same thing. It's like, it's because it's like, that's all they have. Like, it's not like they have wealth or riches or comforts or anything else
Mhm.
like that. They literally only have God.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is just nothing in the way of distracting them
Yeah.
from God. And that was the first thing I thought of when you were when we were talking earlier about
Mhm.
that point you may know about some of those stories from the Holocaust and different things like that. We're nearing the end of the Sermon on the Mount, but at the very beginning, Jesus starts with these Beatitudes, and he talks about the type of people who are actually blessed. And it kind of turns it on its head, and he says, blessed are the poor. Blessed are
Yeah.
those who mourn. Blessed are those who long for justice, who hunger for justice. Like, the reality that God sees a little bit from his perspective of seeing all of it is that sometimes if we don't go through the hard times, then that just means there's going to be way too many things that are going to be in the way between us and God.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that is he would be keeping us from the better thing, basically, by doing that. We've all known people who are like, spoiled kids who've always gotten everything they want. You probably have a friend or somebody you've known who was really rich and their parents gave them everything they wanted. Anything they ever wanted, their parents just gave it to them. I would venture to say none of us grew up in that situation, I assume.
As a child, I did. It's
Yeah.
funny. Yeah, as a child, I would get everything I wanted for Christmas. We tapered off around 2009 is when my dad sold the business, and we became kind of poor after that. But no, as a child,
As a child, you had a little bit of that
as a
experience.
child, I had a little bit
Well,
of
and
that.
so you might know firsthand, but I've seen this with people that I know who are fit into that, where they get everything they want all the time. Those are just worse people to be around sometimes.
I was.
Yeah, the example I think of is in the Harry Potter books,
Mhm.
Harry's cousin, what's his name? Dudley.
Yeah.
He's the worst. He's like,
Mhm.
in the movies at least, he's like, last year there were 39 presents.
Mhm.
Now there's only 38. And, oh, don't worry, we'll go and we'll get you one more. And it's just that sort of spoiled kid who's always gotten everything that they want.
Mhm.
That's a lesser extent, but we kind of recognize even that truth that, like, not getting what you want always
Mm.
builds character
Yeah.
and turns us into better people.
Mhm.
And we've seen that in our own lives. We know people. Some of the people who I think are like some of the most loving, empathetic people that I've ever known are people who I know have gone through some really hard times.
Mm.
And I think it's because of all that like suffering and stuff that they've had to go through that they are just more able to know what matters in life and more able to all that kind of stuff.
I've heard people explain their answer for why evil exists in the world is so we can know how good God is. Because without evil, what is there to judge what good is?
So it's like a comparison thing.
Yeah, it's the idea that, even with the good and the bad that happens in life, when we experience bad things or hard times, when we experience those, we appreciate the good that much more. When we experience, the times when we are poor and we don't have a whole lot of money, and then we experience times where we can bless others with our money, or be able
We
to
appreciate it
provide.
that much more.
We appreciate it, rather than the kid who's always grown up getting everything they want. They never appreciate having things because, well, they've always had things. What do you mean? There's
Yeah.
a reality where things I don't have things?
That's a great example. No, that's perfect. That you said it in like 5 seconds, what I was trying to say in like 5 minutes. But that's exactly right. I think we've experienced that a little bit in a smaller sense with COVID and the season we've been in recently. How many times do you hear people say, man, I just didn't realize how good we had it. I didn't realize what I was taking for granted. I didn't realize getting to go outside and hang out with friends. And something I've heard, I have a lot of musician friends, obviously. They're like, concerts rule. Concerts are awesome. Getting to go to a concert, sit in a room with a whole bunch of people, like sing and sweat and everything all over each other was an incredible experience. And we kind of took it for granted. And they're all just saying now that we're getting kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with a lot of COVID stuff. They were just like, I'm going to enjoy every concert. I'm going to go to every party. I'm going to do all the things that I used to take for granted. And so it can feel simplistic. It can feel dismissive. But I think the thing that I've just started to really, really come to terms with is that for whatever reason, the way the world is right now, unless you go through some of those hard times, you're not going to be the kind of fully formed person that you need to be. And I don't know if it's possible without the suffering.
Yeah. I remember
So-
you. That verse that you preached on. What was that?
Yeah, it's Romans chapter 5.
Romans chapter 5. Okay.
And it talks about the importance of suffering.
Yeah, and just how suffering breeds character.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's probably the most powerful point of it is that it's a reshaping of how you think about it. Like, I don't know if you would think about it in the moment, like in the moment of you undergoing suffering, that it's like shaping you in a good way. And I don't know if you're necessarily supposed to look. I'm still wrestling through this one. You guys might think of it differently than me, and that's fine. It's just I'm not sure I'm able still to look back at some of my own sufferings and say those were good, you know? But I can see that what they brought out into my life and the character that they developed in me was good, you know?
Right.
And so while I wouldn't call what happened good, you know, I can see the good that came from it.
Yeah.
I guess that's helpful in being able to sort of rethink about it all. And there is an interesting hope that Lewis has that I've always really loved, where he talks about how when you make a decision to follow God and Jesus, it's a decision you make in the present, in time. But it's also a decision that you make outside of time, which gets really crazy really quickly. But it's a decision that defines both your future and your past as well. And when we get to heaven, and he thinks get outside of this limited realm of time,
Right.
get beyond the realm of time, we'll actually begin to see how following Jesus affected and purified and made the things that were awful things in our past purposeful and brighter, essentially. And we'll see our decision to follow God and Jesus work backwards into time, nullifying a lot of that hurt and bitterness and bringing out those things that we had, maybe even the goods that we just kind of took for granted, and bringing those up to the forefront and kind of recasting a new perspective on all of our life, essentially. And I've always just really held on to that hope, is that, like, even if what I'm experiencing now in the present or things in my past that I haven't got over yet, that one day when I die, that I'll be able to look back on those and say, you know, that did help, you know?
Yeah, I think one of the big misconceptions is we think the Bible promises us all good things once we become Christians.
Yeah.
And it's very clear in Romans 8:28.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for the good.
Mm-hmm.
Not all things are good, but all things work together for good.
Mm-hmm.
So like you were saying, you don't see exactly how some of your struggles were good,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not the promise of the Bible.
Right.
The promise is what you see. The benefit you got out of that was you can see that benefit now. You don't necessarily know why that event was so bad, and you can't see the good in that specific thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you can definitely tell, well, maybe I grew a little bit from that. Maybe something in my perspective might have changed. You still wrestle with the anger and things from that event. Why did I have to go through that? Why did that specific thing happen?
Yeah.
And I think that falls along with Job.
Mm-hmm.
God never criticized Job for saying those questions.
Mm-hmm.
He says them in every chapter, and every chapter ends with, and Job did not sin against God.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what Romans 8:28 is pointing at. The things may not be good,
but they're going to work together for good.
For good in the long run. Jesus' suffering was not good, but it worked for the good.
And that's, I'm glad you brought up that verse, because I wanted to bring that up in the sermon and just ran out of time and didn't want to like shoehorn it in. But I think that's a great one to bring up ultimately about a lot of this. The promise, like you said, is not everything is good. Everything that happens good. And I want to make that extra clear, because I think this is what conversations like this have a tendency to do sometimes. If you're somebody that's currently going through suffering or has gone through bad things in your life, I want to call that what it is and be like, yeah, that was awful. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. That was painful. That was horrible. And in the grand scheme of things, that's not what you want, and that's not what God wants for you. You know? So it's not that those things were good. But one of the freeing, hopeful things about the Christian life is that you know that that's not wasted bad. But instead, God promises he's going to take that kind of raw material and work it together for something good.
I was thinking about this with the Joker, actually. I think one of the reasons the Joker is so evil is because it's purposeless evil.
Yeah.
You know? Like it's chaotic. It's not. He doesn't have a reason for why he does the things he does.
He's not trying to take over the world.
That's why
he's not trying to half the world's population or the universe's population.
I don't kind of like the new Joker movie and like what they did with it, because I've always felt like the comic book character for the Joker is a character that just enjoys evil for the sake of evil, you know, not someone that has a reason for why they do what they do. I think that's one of the nice things about trusting in God, is that it at least gives a purpose, you know, to the evils that happen in your life. That's hard to wrestle with sometimes, but
there's a direction and a reason for a lot of it.
There's at least some kind of thing that you might be able to look back on and see it move you towards something for the good. So
yeah, and I think that sort of is a major part of what we as humans, we want that. We want to have reason and logic and purposes for the things that we're trying to do. And that is one of the cool kind of promises of the scriptures, is that there's a reason, there's a purpose, there's something going on. There's way more answers we could get into.
Oh yeah.
We always have lots of things that we could kind of talk about, but
our light went out.
It did.
Yeah. Our extra mood lighting turned off. If you're listening to the audio podcast, you didn't see that, but one of our lights just turned off, and I think that's our sign that we need to close this out. So I appreciate all of you for tuning in. Thank you. This is something I really say all the time, but I'm super just thankful to anybody who listens, anybody who has been engaging with the stuff we've been doing. Thank you to all of you for tuning in to these deep dive podcasts. If you get a chance, we would love to also see you on our Sunday services as well. We do them Sundays at 7 o'clock. You should check him out on TikTok. Jacob's been live streaming them on TikTok. So again, I'm going to do that plug again. Follow Jacob at bearded_Christian. It's funny. It fits all of us here at the church for some reason. We all have beards, so he takes our videos and throws them on there. But it's Jacob's channel. He's doing some awesome stuff over there. Go follow him. Maybe watch this church service on live on TikTok next week, and we'll get those viewers up. But either way, we're thankful for you tuning in. We hope to see more of you, and we hope to see you this Sunday or next week for our following deep dive. Bye, everybody.
Later.
Bye.